I'll be reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 7, verse 17. Exodus 7:17. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know what I am, that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood.
Studies on Jehovah versus the gods. We've covered some ground with some false deities and how God has gained the victory over these certain gods, little g gods. But first we looked at Dagon, the Philistine deity, the chief Philistine deity that's found in 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6, and how God was able to overthrow him in a matter of days. We also looked at 1 Kings chapter 17 and 18 and noticed how God was able to overthrow Baal, the Canaanite deity, the prince who rides in the clouds. Well, tonight, what I want us to do, I was talking with Bo a while back, trying to figure out how I should do this, and me and him brainstorm a lot, which is probably very dangerous, but I asked him, there's 10 different plagues, and at least one deity for every plague that God destroys. Should I try and do all of them in one sermon? And he just kind of gave me this look, like, do you really think you can? And I was like, probably not. So what we're going to do, Lord willing, in the next few months, we're going to take each plague and look at each deity that God destroys with the Egyptian culture and what he proves to be in the process. Because as was read just a moment ago, you shall know that I am the Lord. Every time God gives a smiting, if you will, is what it's called, a plague, a smiting upon the Egyptians, there's a purpose behind it. And it is so that everybody in the land, both Israel and the Egyptians, will know that he is Yahweh, that he is the Lord, that he is the great I am. And it's so powerful, in fact, that it's not just the Egyptians and the Israelites that know these things. It was spread throughout the entire known world. We read about this in the very first sermon in this series of Dagon versus Jehovah, that the Philistines said, do you remember what God did to the Egyptians? We don't want to be like that. Let's go ahead and just give up the ark so that way we don't face the same fate as the Egyptians did. So it was known throughout the entire world what happened to the Egyptians and who God was and currently is. He is, in fact, the Lord. Now, in these 10 plagues, we're going to look at the first one this evening. The Nile turned to blood. And there are quite a few deities that are related to the Nile, but the chief deity, his name is Hapi, or Hapi in Egyptian tongue, Hapi, Hapi. And this deity, if you were to see what he looks like, he is usually the color of green or blue to signify fertility and the river itself. And his physique was more of what we would consider obese. He was a much larger individual, and it is described that his stomach and other parts of his body would hang over to symbolize just how prosperous he could be and how prosperous he can make others. In that culture in the day, the fatter you were meant that you had great food and you were very prosperous in your field and in your cattle. Well, this is what Hapi would have looked like, at least into the eyes of the Egyptians. And it sounds very silly, kind of puts a smile on our face of, man, they worshiped a fat deity. And they, to the Egyptians, that was what you wanted. That was peak performance in the eyes of the Egyptian was Hapi. Well, God said, well, you're looking at the wrong deity. You're looking at something that doesn't even exist. You're trying to put yourself in a position or make yourself something that really doesn't even exist. And if you recall, if you look at this deity Hapi, Hapi was the god of fertility and the god of the Nile. Now, the reason is the god of fertility, specifically with like fertile ground, because the Nile River would flood or overflow throughout the year, making the Egyptian land kind of swampy, fertilizing the ground for crops and farmers. Well, Hapi was the one who did that. He would raise the Nile, flood the land, and then recede it back, and that would be the god of fertility. Well, if you recall back in the book of Genesis, the very end of Genesis, what happened in the land of Egypt? I believe that there was a famine in the land for quite a few years. And the one who warned the Egyptians about it was Jehovah God. And who was the one that saved them from that famine and that drought? Well, it was Jehovah God. It wasn't Hapi that saved them. It was God through Joseph and somebody who God used to say, look, you need to teach them about me, the one who can actually provide all of these things. Well, after a period of time, the Egyptians got complacent. They began to rely on their riches because, remember, they kept food back over that period of time, and they would sell it out to all of the people in the land. They became a very rich nation. But what happens when you become a very proud nation? Well, it's just that. You become prideful. You become self-sufficient. Well, I don't need anybody. And then you begin to maybe make other deities and say, well, I want this deity. If I was a deity, I would want this deity to be like this. So they created Hapi. Well, what's so significant about this plague that destroys the idea of this Egyptian deity? This evening, with the time that we have, we're going to just notice 2 points. Verses 14 through 19, we're going to notice Jehovah's message. Jehovah's message. The first half of this plague, or the text of this plague, it's really just talking. It's God giving a message to Moses to relay or deliver to Pharaoh and say, this is what you're going to do and what you're going to say, verses 14 through 19, the message of Jehovah. But then, verses 20 through the end of the chapter, that is 25, you have Jehovah's might. This message is actually carried out, and you see the power of Jehovah overthrowing and overpowering Hapi, the Egyptian deity. Now, let's look at this first point together, verses 14 through 19. Verses 14 through 19, the Jehovah's message. And let's look at verses 14 through 16 together. Jehovah is made known. It says, 14 through 16, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him in the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. You shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Now, if there were somebody to bring a message from God, and it was a message like this, Pharaoh should be trembling at this point. His heart is stubborn. His heart has been hardened. He has denied God's message of let my people go, and he has given Pharaoh a chance without any plagues, proving to be the one true God with the serpent and staff incident with Moses and the 2 magicians. But Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do it. Who is Jehovah? Nobody's even heard of him. Even Moses said, I don't know your name, God. Well, what is your name? Who am I going to say? And God says, tell them that I am sent you. Notice how all of these other deities have all these different names. You've got, in the Egyptian culture, we just mentioned Hapi. You've got the next deity in the frogs, Heket. You've got Osiris. You've got Ra. And then you also have Pharaoh himself who claimed to be a deity. And they have all of these different names that have great meanings behind what they are as a deity. And then you have I am. You know how powerful that is? I am simply just means I am. I am self-existing. I do not need anybody's help. I am the God of everything. I don't need a specific name for the God of the river or the God of the Nile. I don't need a specific name of the God of the crops or God of whatever. I am God of everything. Well, Pharaoh says, I don't believe you. And Moses says, all right, well, the only thing I can do next is just deliver a message from God, and you're not going to like this message, Pharaoh. In verse 14, we see the stubbornness of the ruler. Look at verse 13 with me. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. You know, this term, his heart was hardened, is said multiple times throughout this encounter with Moses and Pharaoh. There's only once where God says, I will harden his heart. And the rest of the times it's Pharaoh hardened his own heart, or Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And some people will say, God hardened his heart. He didn't even give him a chance to have a soft heart. That's not what that means. God did not force Pharaoh to have a hardened heart. What it means that God hardened Pharaoh's heart was Pharaoh was presented with the truth, and Pharaoh, because of God's message, his heart was hardened. It's kind of like this. You've got a ball of wax and you've got a ball of clay, and you put both of them out on the concrete out in Texas in the summer heat. What's going to happen to both of those items? The wax is going to melt and the clay is going to harden. Well, was the sun different to both of those things? No, it was the exact same heat. It was the exact same temperature. It was just the material that was different. Pharaoh's heart was of a different material because of his own means. He hardened his own heart. He didn't want to listen to God. He was stubborn. He was hard-headed. We read about this in the New Testament when Stephen says, you uncircumcised in the heart and stiff-necked. You are a stubborn people. Stephen calls the Jews, you're just like the Gentiles. Really could refer to them as, you're just like Pharaoh. Your heart is hardened. You're a stubborn people. And look at verse 15, a standoff between the gods. This is one of the most fascinating passages in the entire plague section here. Verses 15 and 17 are probably my favorite verses in this whole context, because if you understand the language of the Hebrew with what God is going to tell Moses to do, it is the most humbling and sobering, and it almost gives you goosebumps to see this play out. Look what it says in verse 15. Station yourself to meet him at the bank of the Nile. Who does Moses represent? Moses is a messenger of God. He is a prophet. He is a leader of God's people, or is fixing to be. He represents Jehovah. Who does Pharaoh represent? Pharaoh represents all of the other deities, including himself, who professes to be a deity, a descendant of the gods. God says, I want you to face off with the other deities. Me and Hapi are fixing to face off, and we're going to see just which one is the one true deity. The Nile was worshipped under various deities and gods and symbols. At Memphis, especially, as Hapi, the one that we've described, a god named Apis, the sacred bull, a sacred black bull, I believe with gold or white horns. That has more of a Greek root system there. And then Osiris, of whom the Nile was seen as the embodiment of. So Hapi was more of the guardian of the Nile, whereas Osiris was the embodiment of the Nile. So you can see what God's fixing to do. He's fixing to get a 2-for-1 here with this face-off with Pharaoh. And in putting Moses in between Pharaoh, what is Pharaoh doing? He's going down to the Nile. Why is he going down to the Nile? You know, I always thought, and if you watch Hollywood's rendition of Pharaoh and Moses facing off with the Nile, it's usually Pharaoh going into the Nile to take a bath or to wash himself. Most likely, he probably was going to do that, but most likely he was fixing to pay tribute or to worship the Nile. Pharaoh was going down to the Nile to worship his deities. And what was the message that God told Pharaoh just previously before Pharaoh was fixing to worship his gods? He tells Pharaoh, I want you to let my people go so they can worship me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to let your people worship you. You know what God says? Well, I'm not going to let Hapi get worshiped by his people. So you go and interrupt Pharaoh's worship, and you put yourself in between the Nile and Pharaoh, and let's just see what happens. Pharaoh's not going to get to worship his deity, is what God is saying. And Pharaoh, most likely paying homage, if it's the case that Pharaoh's fixing to go down and do this, the miracle that's about to take place is going to be so extraordinary, and it's going to be way deeper than meets the eye. Because think about it. If you're about to go and worship your God, that is the Nile River, and a man steps in between you and the Nile and says, I've got a message from God. I'm fixing to strike the Nile and turn it to blood. What do you think that's symbolizing? It's saying, I'm fixing to murder your deity before you can even worship it. Now, look at verse 16 with me. The servant of righteousness. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Moses is representing Jehovah, the one true God. And here's his message. You ignored my first message, that is to let my people go so they can worship me. And remember the context. Pharaoh is trying to worship his God. So Jehovah is not only going to prevent Pharaoh from worshiping his deity, but God is going to kill this deity. Now, with this prep work leading up to the miracle, Pharaoh still thinks that he's all powerful. He still thinks, man, I beat Moses, even though he kind of ate up my magician's staffs. I mean, I'm still Pharaoh. I still have my deities. Now look what happens in verses 17 to 19. Hapi is made powerless. Look at verse 17 with me. We see putting to death of the Egyptian gods. Look at verse 17. It says, thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the water that is in the Nile with the staff that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood. Now, this is where we have to dig deep into our study and be diligent in our studies and look at what's called a word study. Look at the word that Moses uses specifically to describe what he's going to do to the Nile. He's fixing to strike. He's fixing to strike the Nile. What does this word strike mean? In the Hebrew, it means to be stricken across the face, to be murdered, to be killed, or defeated. So what Moses has just said is, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. I'm fixing to murder your God. So that's how God is fixing to display the knowledge of I am the one true deity, is by murdering, slapping across the face, and putting to death the Nile deities. Now, look at this next term. What's going to happen after he strikes it? It will be turned to blood. You know, a lot of theologians and scholars will say that it actually means it will be turned to the appearance of blood. That's false. The Bible says it was turned to blood. Now, why on earth would scholars say it would be the appearance of blood? Well, if you know anything about the Nile River and the process that it goes through in overflowing to fertilize the earth in Egypt, Egypt is called, or it goes by another name or title. It goes by the gift of the Nile. Egypt was only able to exist because the Nile existed. There was desert on either side of Egypt, but because of that one river, Egypt was able to exist. And it wasn't just your natural river. It was a very unique river. It was a river that it was on almost like a time clock, where at a certain point of the year, specifically the middle of June, June 25th to be exact, the water would start out as green, almost swampy. It wasn't clean. It was undrinkable, and it was a swamp where all the alligators would love to house themselves, along with all of the frogs. But then throughout the year, the water would overflow. And then it would raise and raise until eventually it went from green to a crystal clear. And it was perfectly clean drinking water for a good period of time. But it would continue to overflow. And then it would go from crystal clear to yellowish to ultimately a red color naturally. And it was because of these microscopic organisms and algae and moss that would cause this red color. That's why a lot of scholars would say God just sped up the process. That way they couldn't have any clean drinking water. Well, there's a problem with that. One, that's not what God said he would do. He didn't say, I will speed up the process and make it look like blood. He said, I'm going to turn it to blood. Why would God turn it to blood? Well, I believe that there are a few reasons for that. It will be turned to blood. Well, what do you think that would symbolize? What did he say he was going to do to the Nile? I'm fixing to murder it. What happens when you murder something or someone? You spill their blood. Something else that it might symbolize is, if you recall, 80 years prior to this, what happened in the Nile? Moses was just a baby, and all of those infants were thrown into the Nile River. You know, there were about 1.5 to 2 million Hebrews at that time, and all of the babies from the ages of 5 and under were thrown into the Nile River. Do you think that the Nile River probably flowed with blood that day? I believe so. With all the crocodiles and all of the sea creatures there to eat up those infants. Very morbid picture, yes. That's how cruel Pharaoh was. Maybe God was trying to imprint something or bring back to memory of something that Pharaoh did. But you know something else that God was doing when he turned it to blood is, you can take dirty water and boil it and get clean water. You can't boil blood. Have you ever tried boil? You know, I've been hunting with Haley's granddaddy multiple times, and he taught me how to clean a deer and how to take it out and gut it and do the things to prepare the meat. Well, if there are times where I forgot to take water, and I never at one point in that hunting trip thought, you know, if I just take some of this deer blood and boil it, I could probably get something to drink. That's not my first thought. That's not anybody's first thought, because you can't boil blood to drink it. God was making it completely undrinkable, symbolizing the death of their deity. And also, do you know what happens in verse 18 of when the water was turned to blood? He didn't just kill the deity. Look what else he killed. Look at verse 18. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile. What is God doing when he turns the water into blood? Well, the fish will die, number one. The Nile will become foul, number two, and they will find difficult in finding water from the Nile. Now, I like the way the King James renders this. They shall loathe to drink of the water of the river. Now, that's very interesting that it uses the word loathe, because remember, what is the Nile? It is a blessing to Egypt. Well, if you're loathing something that is a blessing, it is no longer a blessing. It is a hindrance. It is a curse to you. What is God doing by taking these three things away from them, or causing these three things? By killing the fish, he destroys their food source. The Nile River was a freshwater. You would receive freshwater fish from the Nile. The Egyptians thought it was unwholesome and almost a curse to eat saltwater fish, so fish from the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River flowed into the Mediterranean, so they thought the purest form of fish comes from the Nile. Well, they no longer have fish that's fresh, which means they're going to have to either starve or they're going to have to eat something unwholesome. Now, I know fish was not their only source of food, but it was the majority of their food. Now, what about the second thing? The Nile became foul. It destroys their psyche. Now, I don't know about you. I know since COVID, a lot of us have lost our taste, have lost our smell. Maybe it's not as good as it used to be. I have a very sensitive nose, so much so that I pawn off every stinky diaper to Haley. I can't handle it. My nose just can't handle that. And ironically, little man understands this, and he will not give this diaper until I'm out of the house. I thank him for that. Imagine not being able to escape a stench that fills the entire land. You can't sleep, you can't think, you can't work, you can't eat, you can't drink, you can't do anything because it stinks. What stinks? Well, you have an entire river made of blood. Blood does not smell good, as well as all the fish and sea creature or water creatures that are in the Nile. All of them are dead. They're showing up on the banks, and it stinks. Imagine the Egyptians. What are we going to do? We can't eat, we can't drink, we got to deal with this stench, as well as it's going to be difficult to find something to survive now. What was Hapi to them? It was a guardian. Who was Osiris? It was the embodiment of fresh water. Both of those individuals are dead now. Who's going to protect us? Who's going to provide for us? God says, if you would just listen to me, everything would be fine. But Pharaoh has hardened his heart, and he is stubborn, and now look what you're going to have to deal with. Look at verse 19 with me. The pollution of the water. He further describes what happens by turning the river Nile into blood. Look what it says in verse 19. Excuse me. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their streams, and over their pools, and over all their reservoirs of water, that they may become blood. And there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone." You know, he did not just turn the water to blood in the Nile. He turned the water from all of the vessels and everything within the village to blood. Look what it says. The streams, the rivers, the ponds, and every single vessel. Now, what do each of these things mean? The streams, natural branches from the Nile of Egypt. If you look at a map in Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, what runs into the Mediterranean is a very thin stream river, but then it breaks off into these branches. He says even the smallest pockets of water that come out from the Nile will be turned to blood. Now, what about the rivers? This Hebrew word river, there weren't really other rivers. It was more canals, man-made canals. So they would dig out trenches and build it in such a way that it would pull water into the village, but it would open up only during the flooding of the Nile, and then it would close during the time that the Nile would be undrinkable. God says, I'm going to attack their canals as well. Look what the ponds, fountains and vessels or cisterns. These would have been more related to the barrels of large jugs containing water in each home. Now, if you look at how God specifies the wooden vessels and the stone vessels, you know, there's a reason that we need to look at every single word that's written in Scripture. Jesus even says, not one jot or one tittle will pass away until all is fulfilled. There's a reason that God specifies wooden and stone vessels. The Egyptians would retrieve the water through the canals, put them in wooden vessels specifically made of almond wood, and then they would cover the wooden vessel with almond paste to try and filter this water. What is God doing with this? Well, this is what God's doing. God takes away the streams, the largest water source. He takes away the canals, the medium water source. He takes away their vessels, the smallest water source, and the wooden and stone vessels, the purest water source. God says they're going to have absolutely nothing. I'm taking everything away from them. There is nothing that these Egyptians are going to have that they can point back and say, my deity gave me this. They're going to be looking around saying, where's my deity? All of the water is taken. How am I going to live? God says, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. This is how powerful God is. And he's showing Pharaoh and all of Egypt what he's about to do. He hasn't even done this yet. And notice, this is the message that Pharaoh's fixing to receive. You think if you heard this, you'd be like, all right, before you do that, just take your people. Pharaoh goes through this 10 different times. This is just the first plague. Now look at point number 2, the actual execution of this message, verses 20 to 25, Jehovah's might. Look at verses 20 to 25 with me. Excuse me. It says, so Moses and Aaron did even as the Lord had commanded, and he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Then Pharaoh turned and went into his house with no concern even for this. So all the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. In verses 20 to 21, we see Jehovah's might or Jehovah's power. In verse 20, the defilement of the river, God's servants were obedient. Notice who the plague actually affected. It's throughout the entire land of Egypt, but who did it affect? Because you've also got the Israelites there. You've got 2.5 to 3 million Israelites at this point living in the country of Egypt, but they're living in Goshen. God targets the Egyptian people. We even see at the very last plague, we're going to get there, hopefully, Lord willing, in the coming months, that even within the same town, certain people would die while others would remain alive because they obeyed. God targets the disobedient in this context. What does this mean for us? It means that if we take pride in our own power, in our own riches, God's going to say, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. And we're going to lose everything that we thought that we owned. It targeted Pharaoh, it targeted the Egyptian servants, it targeted the Egyptian civilians, and the Egyptian gods. But God makes it very clear. When I strike or kill your God, the followers of the said God suffers too. Why would God do that? Because when you mess with my people, God says, you mess with me. So if you're going to not listen to me by not letting my people go, I'm going to kill your God, and it's going to trickle down to the smallest civilian in Egypt. And through all of this, you shall know that I am Yahweh. I am Jehovah. The river turned to blood. We already mentioned how it was the literal blood and how it affected the people. Now look at, with all of that being said, it being the literal blood and the damage that it would do to their economic system, look at Pharaoh's response to this. 22 to 23, Pharaoh's pride. Look what it says. It says in verse 22, but the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord said. Now notice this in verse 23. Then Pharaoh turned and went into his house with no concern. Literally, he waved his hand in the Hebrew. Imagine you see your economic system fail. Your life source for your entire country fall to pieces in a matter of seconds, and you do this, and you go back into your house. That was Pharaoh. Pharaoh was so consumed with pride that he couldn't see what was right before his eyes. Now, what I find fascinating, though, It says that the magicians were able to do this with their secret arts. Now, when I read this, I thought, how? How are they able to do this? And I called a preacher, an older preacher, very experienced and well-versed in the book of Exodus. And I told him, I'm very confused about this. How do I explain that the magicians were able to do this? And he says, you don't. And I thought, what do you mean I don't? I got to explain how they were able to do this. And he says, no, you explain it how God explains it, how they weren't able to do it to the extent that God did it. And I thought, that's a very interesting concept, because how are they described? First off, they're magicians. What is a magician? They do magic tricks. I have seen somebody be cut in half but still remain alive. Were they actually cut in half by the magician? No, there was an illusion. It was deceit. They were deceiving the senses to make it appear as if it was something. Well, if you read later on in Exodus chapter 8, the very next chapter, the magicians were able to copy 2 different plagues, the first 2. Water turned to blood, and then the frogs. But notice in chapter 8 and verse 18, it says, the magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. They could only fake it for so long. And these magicians are referenced in the New Testament by name. Look at what Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also opposed the truth, men of depraved mind, rejected in regard to the faith. But they will not make further progress, for their folly will be obvious to all, just as Jannes's and Jambres' folly was also. Paul says, yeah, they were able to fool some people for a little bit, but their failure and their folly was very obvious. After a couple of magic tricks, you could clearly see that they were just faking it. God wasn't. God said, by this you will know, you will have full assurance and knowledge that I am the one true God. But you know what? Even though they were faking it, sometimes that's just enough for people to dismiss the truth. In verse 23, it says, Pharaoh turned and went into his house. He waved his hand. You can present truth all day long to some people, but their hearts are just hardened. And they can have just the smallest form of deceit, the smallest form of magician trickery, and say, well, that's good enough for me to believe that there is no Jehovah. And then they'll go back into their home as if the Nile's not turning to blood. And we think, how? How can they not see this and repent? It's because they're prideful. It's because their heart is made of clay. Even though God is all-powerful and he is all-knowing and his word is sharper than any two-edged sword, it still allows mankind to make a choice. He still gave Pharaoh a choice. He gave choice after choice after choice, chance after chance, plague after plague, until ultimately the Egyptians were begging the Israelites. They were buying the Israelites off, saying, leave. We'll pay you to get out of our city. We'll give you all the gold. We'll give you all the cattle. Just get out. Sometimes you can present the truth over and over again, and you'll have those 2 responses. Either they will completely reject it and say, I don't have any care for this, or they'll say, I'll pay you to leave. Just quit talking about God. But you know what? On the day of judgment, that chance will be over. And they will, as Paul would say in the book of Philippians, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. Confess what? That he is God. That he is in fact the Lord. And sadly, for those people who wave their hand at the truth and who try to just do anything to get God out of their lives, in verse 24 to 25, we'll see what their outcome will be. The Egyptians' pain. Egypt's pain. What's going to happen is they'll be in so much pain that they will be on their hands and knees trying to dig for something that's not there. digging for water. They had to dig around to try and find some form of water because their God was not providing it. And then in verse 25, we see the duration of the plague. This marks the duration of the plague. The natural discoloration lasted about 20 days, but the plague only lasted for 7. Now, even though the discoloration would have lasted for 20 days, they still could have drank the water by boiling it if they were that desperate. But you can't do that with blood. And notice 7 days, a perfect number. In the book of Genesis, we read about in Sodom and Gomorrah, there were men who wanted to fulfill their desires with angelic hosts. And Lot said, you're not going to do that. How about you take my daughters, which is terrible parenting, by the way, but he said, don't do it with man because that's against nature. Do it with a woman. Take them as your wife. That way you're not being an abomination to God. And they said, we want to do what we want to do, and we'll take you as well. And God struck them blind. And you know what's fascinating? I've never noticed this until I read it the other day. It says that when they were struck blind, they fell on their knees and tried to grasp at Lot and the men. They were struck blind. Their senses were taken away. They didn't know the right hand from their left hand, and they were still trying to fulfill their disgusting desires. Egypt did not have their life source, and they were trying to find something. They were on their hands and knees digging in the dirt, trying to find water, and they're not finding anything because they were not looking to God for life. On the day of judgment, there are going to be people in hell digging, trying to find something, blinded by the eternal darkness, saying, I got to find something. But they're never going to find it. But they'll know that God is Lord, but it'll be too late. Brethren, do not be like the Egyptians. Don't be stubborn. Don't be hard-hearted. And don't try to look for something. Don't try to look for something that's provided by something that doesn't even exist. Look to God, the one true deity that gives eternal life, because he is the God of the Nile. He is the God of everything, and he will provide everything that you need if you just seek him first in his kingdom. And it may be that you have been like Pharaoh for far too long. Your heart is hardened, and it's been clay, but you decide, you know what? My heart needs to be broken. I need to have a broken and contrite heart, and God needs to rebuild me and put me back together. He can do that if you just surrender and humble yourself. Or maybe you are like the Egyptians. You're on your hands and knees digging, trying to find something, but you can't find it because you're looking in the wrong spots. Or maybe you're like Moses. You are a faithful servant, but you're rejected, and you're made fun of, and you need prayers for strength. Whatever the case may be, I beg and plead that you come now as together we stand and as we sing.